The evening had started like any other. The dishes were done. The television hummed softly in the background. Outside, the city lights flickered against the kitchen window. She stood at the sink, drying her hands, already mentally calculating the bills for the month: rent, groceries, electricity, school supplies. The numbers had become her silent companions over the years. Then he said it: "Sweetheart, starting with this salary, we're switching to a separate budget. I'm tired of supporting you." The words did not sound loud. They weren't shouted, but they echoed in her chest like a slammed door. She turned slowly. For a second, she thought it was a joke. He had that half-serious expression he sometimes wore when testing boundaries. But his face stayed cold, almost relieved, as if he had finally unloaded something heavy. Supporting you. The phrase replayed in her mind. For 8 years of marriage, she had worked too, just not in ways that came with paychecks and promotions. When their son was born, they had agreed she would stay home, just for a while. Childcare was expensive, and he was building his career. It made sense. At least, that's what he had said. A while became years. She woke up at 6 a.m. every day, packed lunches, ironed shirts, took their son to school, cleaned the house, cooked dinner, paid bills online, managed doctor appointments, remembered birthdays. She had been the invisible engine that kept the family moving. And now she was being supported. She sat down across from him at the table. "What do you mean?" she asked quietly. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I mean exactly what I said. I work hard. I earn the money. It's unfair that I carry everything. If you want spending money, get a job. We'll split everything 50-50. 50-50. She almost laughed. "Who will pick up our son from school?" she asked. "You'll figure it out," he shrugged. "Plenty of women work." There it was, the comparison. The unspoken accusation. "You're not enough." She nodded slowly, but something inside her shifted. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was clarity. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to his steady breathing beside her. A strange calm washed over her. For years, she had accepted her role without question. She had believed that love meant sacrifice. That partnership meant supporting his ambitions. But partnership also meant respect. The next morning, she did something she hadn't done in years. After dropping their son at school, she updated her resume. At first, doubt crept in. Her last official job had been nearly a decade ago. The world had changed. Technology had evolved. Would anyone hire her? But she remembered something important. Skills don't disappear. Organization, time management, negotiation, budgeting, problem solving, she had practiced them daily. Running a household wasn't laziness. It was unpaid labor. She applied to 5 jobs. Then 10. Then 20. Rejections came. Some didn't respond at all. One recruiter politely told her they were looking for someone with more recent experience. The word stung, but she refused to let them define her. At dinner, he didn't ask about her day. He talked about his promotion, his new client, his bonus. She listened, as she always had, but something had changed. She no longer felt small. She felt determined. 2 weeks later, her phone rang. A mid-sized company was looking for an administrative coordinator. The salary wasn't huge, but it was steady. The hours matched her son's school schedule. They were impressed by her volunteer work at the community center and her ability to multitask. She got the job. When she told him, he looked surprised, almost unsettled. "That was fast," he said. "Yes," she replied simply. The first paycheck felt different in her hands. It wasn't about the amount. It was about proof. She was capable. She was valuable. At the end of the month, she placed her contribution on the kitchen table. "Here's my half," she said. He blinked. "What? You wanted separate budgets. 50-50. I calculated the bills. This is my share." He stared at the envelope. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. The new system started immediately. Groceries were split. Utilities were divided. Even small purchases were calculated. At first, he seemed satisfied, proud, even. But reality soon crept in. When their son needed new sneakers, she paid her half. When the car needed repairs, she paid her half. When he suggested a weekend getaway, she calmly replied, "It's not in my personal budget this month." Slowly, the emotional distance grew. Not because she was angry, but because she had stopped giving freely. She gave exactly what was required. Nothing more. One evening, their son asked innocently, "Mom, why don't you and Dad laugh together anymore?" The question hung in the air. That night, after their son went to bed, he spoke. "This feels strange," he admitted. "You chose it," she answered gently. "I didn't mean," he paused. "I didn't think it would feel like roommates." She looked at him for a long moment. That's what happens when you reduce a marriage to transactions. Silence filled the room. He rubbed his temples. "I felt pressured, like everything depended on me. I was stressed. I said things I shouldn't have. And I felt invisible," she replied. "Like what I did didn't count." It was the first honest conversation they'd had in years. He hadn't realized the weight she carried. The mental load, the constant planning, the emotional labor. He had seen only numbers, income versus expenses, not effort versus exhaustion. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. She didn't respond immediately. Apologies were easy. Change was harder. Over the next months, something unexpected happened. He started participating more, picking up groceries, cooking once a week, attending parent-teacher meetings, not because of money, but because he began to understand what partnership truly meant. The separate budget slowly dissolved, not through argument, but through awareness. One evening, he placed his card on the table and said, "Let's go back to being a team." She smiled faintly. "Being a team means respect." "I know," he nodded. Marriage, she realized, is not about who earns more. It's about who cares more. It's about recognizing that value doesn't always come with a salary. She never quit her job. Not because she needed to prove anything, but because she liked the independence. The confidence, the reminder that she could stand on her own. And he never again used the word, support, as a weapon. Their story wasn't about money. It was about dignity. Sometimes, the most painful words reveal the deepest truths. He thought he was carrying her. He didn't realize she had been carrying the family all along. In the end, the separate budget didn't break their marriage. It exposed it, and in that exposure, they finally saw each other clearly, not as provider and dependent, but as partners. Because love is not measured in paychecks. It's measured in respect. The first few months after they returned to being a team were not magical. There was no dramatic music, no cinematic embrace that erased the past. Trust does not regenerate overnight. Respect, once cracked, requires deliberate rebuilding. But something subtle had changed. He no longer walked into the house expecting dinner to be ready. If she was still finishing work on her laptop, he would quietly check the fridge and start chopping vegetables. The first time he did it, he moved awkwardly, as if entering unfamiliar territory. He didn't know where the spices were. He overcooked the rice. The kitchen looked like a battlefield afterward. But she didn't criticize him. She simply handed him a towel and said, "We'll clean together." And they did. It was in these small, imperfect moments that their second chapter began. Yet change is rarely linear. One evening, after reviewing their bank account, he frowned. "We're spending more than before." She raised an eyebrow. "Because we're both participating now. Convenience costs money. Shared responsibilities cost time." He hesitated. Old habits almost resurfaced. The instinct to calculate, to assign blame. But instead, he asked, "Can we plan together?" That single sentence mattered more than any apology he had offered before. They sat down with notebooks, not to divide, but to understand. They wrote down everything. Fixed expenses, savings goals, personal spending, their son's education fund, even small joys like occasional dinners out. For the first time in years, finances were not a battlefield. They were a conversation, and in that conversation, deeper truths surfaced. "I was scared," he admitted quietly. "Of what?" she asked. "Of failing, of not earning enough, of being the only pillar holding everything up." She listened carefully, and instead of sharing that fear, she said softly, "You turned it into control." He nodded. "And I turned my exhaustion into silence," she replied. They were not enemies. They were two overwhelmed adults who had stopped communicating honestly. The separate budget had been a symptom, not the disease. As weeks passed, their dynamic continued evolving. He began taking their son to school twice a week. At first, it felt like a logistical adjustment. But soon, it became something more. He learned the names of the teachers. He noticed the other parents. He listened to their son talk about math tests and playground dramas. One afternoon, while waiting outside the school gates, he called her. "I didn't realize how much you used to handle alone," he said. She smiled on the other end of the line. "Now you do." Perspective is powerful. Meanwhile, her job was growing into more than a paycheck. She was learning new software systems, leading small projects, even mentoring a younger colleague. Each success quietly restored parts of her identity that had been dormant for years. One Friday, she came home excited. They offered me a small raise, she said, trying not to sound too proud. Instead of defensiveness, he felt admiration. That's amazing, he said genuinely. And he meant it. The old version of him might have felt threatened. The old version might have calculated percentages, who earns more now? Who contributes more? But something had shifted fundamentally. They were no longer measuring. They were building. Still, healing required confronting the deeper wound. One night, long after their son had fallen asleep, she asked the question that had lingered quietly inside her. When you said you were tired of supporting me, did you really believe I was a burden? He didn't answer immediately. I believed I was alone in the pressure, he said carefully. And when I feel alone, I get defensive. I look for someone to blame. She absorbed his words. I need you to understand something, she said. Even if I never worked a paid job again, that would not make me less valuable. I understand that now, he replied. But I need to hear you say it, she insisted gently. He looked directly at her. You were never a burden. I was blind. That sentence closed a wound she hadn't fully acknowledged. Because it wasn't about money. It had never been about money. It was about worth. In the months that followed, they created new habits intentionally. Every Sunday evening became family meeting time, not a corporate-style budget review, but an open space. They discussed schedules, concerns, goals, even emotions. Sometimes their son participated, proudly presenting drawings or announcing school achievements. Other times, it was just the two of them talking honestly about stress before it hardened into resentment. They also created personal accounts, not as separation, but as autonomy. Each of them had money they could spend without explanation. It wasn't about secrecy, it was about dignity, freedom inside commitment. One afternoon, while organizing old documents, she found her original resume from years ago, the one she had updated the night he declared the separate budget. She held it in her hands, remembering that sleepless night. The sting, the shock, the clarity. In a strange way, she felt grateful. Not for the pain, but for the awakening. Without that moment, she might have continued living half-visible. He might have continued carrying silent stress. Their marriage might have remained functional but distant. Crisis had forced growth. Growth had demanded humility. And humility had rebuilt connection. But growth also brought a new challenge. Her career began accelerating faster than expected. She was offered a leadership training program that required occasional evening sessions. It was a significant opportunity. 10 months earlier, she would have declined automatically. This time, she didn't. When she brought it up at dinner, she watched his reaction carefully. That's big, he said thoughtfully. How often are the sessions? Twice a week for 3 months. He nodded slowly. We'll adjust, he said. There was no hesitation, no calculation of inconvenience, no subtle resentment, just partnership, and they did adjust. He managed homework on training nights, burned a few dinners, ordered takeout more often than usual, survived. More importantly, he respected her ambition the way she had once respected his. Respect, when mutual, feels light. As her confidence grew, so did her clarity about boundaries. One evening, during a minor disagreement about scheduling, he jokingly said, "Careful, or we're going back to separate budgets." He meant it lightly. She didn't laugh. He noticed immediately. "I'm sorry," he said. "That wasn't funny." "It wasn't," she replied calmly. Because certain wounds, even healed ones, leave scars. He learned to treat those scars gently. Their son, meanwhile, was observing everything. Children learn from dynamics, not lectures. One afternoon, he drew a picture of their family. 3 figures holding hands. Above them, he wrote, "Team." She showed the drawing to her husband. He swallowed hard. That simple word carried weight. They had almost become opponents in the same house. Now they were modeling something different, cooperation without competition. Time passed. Arguments still happened. Stress still surfaced. Life remained unpredictable. But the foundation was different. Instead of assuming intent, they asked questions. Instead of tallying contributions, they acknowledged effort. Instead of threatening independence, they supported it. One quiet night, sitting on the balcony with tea, he said something unexpected. "If you hadn't gotten that job, if you had just argued instead, we might not be here." She considered that. "If you hadn't felt uncomfortable seeing me stand on my own," she replied, "we might not be here either." Growth requires both courage and humility. He had been forced to confront his ego. She had been forced to confront her silence. Together, they confronted their assumptions. Years later, when friends complained about money problems or power struggles in marriage, she often thought about that evening, the sentence that had once felt like a breaking point. Starting with this salary, or switching to a separate budget. It could have been the end. Instead, it became a mirror. A mirror that reflected insecurity, imbalance, and miscommunication. But also potential, because relationships don't fail from conflict alone. They fail from unaddressed conflict. That one harsh declaration had forced them to address everything. Financial fairness, emotional labor, identity, respect, fear, ambition. Nothing remained hidden, and in the light of honesty, resentment lost its power. One evening, years after the incident, they celebrated her promotion to department manager. Their son, now taller, more confident, raised a glass of juice. To Mom, he said proudly. The strongest one, her husband added softly, to partnership. She looked around the table, at the life they had rebuilt intentionally. Strength is not about earning more. Power is not about controlling money. Leadership is not about dominance. True partnership is about recognizing value beyond numbers. She never forgot the pain of that original sentence. But she no longer resented it. Because sometimes, the words that hurt the most are the ones that wake us up. He had once believed he was carrying her. Now he knew better. They carried each other, and that made all the difference.